now, and we'll just let it unfold. It'll be a Christmas gift to you as we're unwrap it for the rest of our time together. Let me set up, get our notes. There we go. All right. Okay, so like I said, tonight is when it starts to get really fun. All right, we're going to look at the next step in the process. But before we do that, I just wanted to quickly remind us of where we've been and what we've covered, and then dive into the next step where we really get into some of the details and what I think is the most important step in the exegetical process as we study the scripture. But the last couple of weeks, we focused our attention on the contextual flow of the book. And again, if you'll remember, that contextual flow is just another way to say the author's flow of thought. Again, each book is set up where the entire message of the book is broken up into units of thought that are expressed, one particular unit of thought to the next, and they're all connected together, and all of them are like a stream. They form the context of the book that you are studying, and that each thought is not independent from the other thoughts. They're all linked together, sort of like this diagram. And in an epistle, we remember that those thoughts are expressed, each unit of thought is expressed in a paragraph. These paragraphs can be long or short, but each one of them contains a central idea, a particular thought that the author is using to build his theme, what he is trying to teach within the course of that epistle. And so, for example, we've been looking at Philemon as an exercise for us. And I've just put here, these are the paragraphs of Philemon that we've been studying. And notice there's the introductory paragraph in verses 1 to 3. And then Paul introduces the letter with his prayer in verses 4 to 7. And then the main body of the letter has focused on Paul's appeal, and he appeals in two ways. And that's shown in the third paragraph and in the fourth paragraph. And then there's the conclusion. All right, so this is a short letter, but it is typical of the idea of one paragraph to the next, each focusing on a particular unit of thought, and then all of them together giving us the message of the book or the purpose for which the author has written the letter. And so that's what is summarized here. Last week, we went through a couple of the paragraphs and summarized their main point, and so that you can follow the author's flow of thought. And again, we summarized each paragraph. This isn't an outline point where we just said the topic, but actually what the author says about that topic. And then that led us to the purpose of this letter, Paul's appeal to Onesimus to receive him back so that he would encourage Christian fellowship throughout the church. All right, so that's just an example, a big picture. All right, the contextual flow of the letter. Every book, every epistle has this structure. This is the normal form of communication. Poetry is expressed in stanzas. So you'll have several stanzas put together that express the author's flow of thought. Narrative, it's in a story which is broken up into scenes. But for an epistle, it is the paragraph. All right? And so that's where we left off last time. And notice here, the first three steps in the process that we've covered so far in these last 7 or 8 weeks is read and observe, and then notice the book. Discover the background context of the book. Discover the contextual flow of the book. These are all book level. These are all, we're looking at the book as a whole rather than diving into focusing on a particular passage at the beginning. And that's because we want to see the big picture. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. I don't know if you've done puzzles, But it's helpful when you do a puzzle to look at the whole picture, to see what you're doing. What's the goal here? What am I trying to uncover? That's the best way to do a puzzle, because then if you know what the whole puzzle is, then you can focus on each piece later and you'll know how it fits in that puzzle. Joshua and I had a professor, I think Joshua, you took Dr. Thomas, right? Did you have Dr. Thomas for? Well, Dr. Thomas, he was responsible for editing the New Testament for the New American Standard Bible. And so he taught exegesis. He taught some of the things we're looking at here for our seminary class. And one thing he would often say is, before you get to the worm's eye view, you need to have the bird's eye view. And his point was, we want to see it from the 10,000 meter level before we dive in to look at the 1 meter level. Now, why do you think that is? Why do we start with studying the book as a whole before going to the passage? Because we're not going to teach the whole book every sermon, right? We want to teach a particular passage. So why bother with studying the context, background context, the contextual flow, reading the whole book? Why not just focus our time and our effort on the specific passage we want to teach? Well, we have to remember each passage is part of a context, right? We spent time the last several weeks talking about that. You cannot take a verse or a word or a phrase or even a paragraph and just focus on that without knowing the rest of the book. Again, I bring you back to that illustration of standing on the bridge. The best way to understand the direction the water is flowing underneath you, especially if you can't see it, is to see how the water is flowing on each side of the bridge. If you understand or know which way the water's flowing on each side of the bridge, you'll know the direction underneath you. And that's very similar to studying a book of Scripture. If you know what is said before and after your passage, you'll have a good understanding of your passage. All right? Most Bible error and most bad teaching, most inaccurate sermons come from the fact that the preacher doesn't pay attention to the context. He doesn't pay attention to what's said before and after his passage. All right, and so we want to know what that is, or at least have an idea before we focus our attention on a particular verse or paragraph within the book. Okay, so that's where we've been. I want to just open it up, make sure if there are any questions before we go on to the next step. Hopefully nothing's new here that I just said. All right. Okay. Well, once we've identified from the background context, the contextual flow, once we've identified the author's flow of thought, and we have an idea of the purpose of the book, the purpose of the letter that he wrote, we're ready to begin to narrow our focus. And the next step, and the one I believe is probably the most important one, but also the most difficult one, is the block diagram. That's what, or some call it the structural diagram, some call it phrasing. There's different terms, but essentially it's called the block diagram. So let me explain what that is, and then we'll look at the details. This is just an overview. Again, think about how an epistle is structured. All right, an epistle overall has these series of paragraphs, right? A series of units of thought from the author. Now, each paragraph is also broken up into smaller parts, and those parts are called sentences. And then each sentence is broken up into smaller parts, and those smaller parts are called phrases and clauses. So you can see, as we start from the big picture, we have paragraphs, and then each paragraph can be broken down into sentences, And then each of those sentences can be broken down into its basic components or parts, clauses, and phrases. So again, let me take you back to just sort of a visual image of here is the epistle level for Philemon. All right, again, where each paragraph is a unit of thought and they're connected together. Now, if I were to take one of these paragraphs, let's say verses 4 to 7, on the paragraph level, this is the second paragraph from Philemon, that second paragraph is made up of 3 sentences. All right? And those sentences, we can then take and break them down. And we call that the sentence level. And the sentence level, let's say for verse 4, that first sentence here, we can break that up into its smaller parts. And I've just noted those smaller parts called phrases and clauses. I've noted those by highlighting them in different colors. All right, so each of these series of words that are highlighted in a particular color represents a phrase or clause. All right, and so we're breaking down now and focusing our attention on the smaller pieces. We've been looking at the big pieces here, the epistle level, the paragraphs. Now what we want to do is focus our attention on a particular paragraph. And to do that, to identify, to understand a particular paragraph, we need to break it down into its sentences. And those sentences are broken down into these phrases and clauses, these smaller parts. Okay? So that's the intent now, is to taking those smaller parts, how do they relate to one another? How are they connected to each other? How did the author bring these phrases and clauses together in order to communicate a particular point? How are they linked? Well, that's where the block diagram comes into focus here in step 4. And that diagram is a visual picture of that relationship between the phrases and the clauses. And here's just an example of that from verses 4 and 5. These verses here, which, in fact, let me just pull up the diagram. I'll bring it together. All right. So here is a diagram, a block diagram of verses 4 and 5. Again, the first sentence from the second paragraph in Philemon. And I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but just to show you visually, notice you have one sentence, one clause that's brought all the way to the left. That's the main sentence. You remember before when we were looking at the contextual flow? And I said, how do you summarize a paragraph? You look for the main sentence. That's the first thing. That's the main subject and verb, the main action. And then the other parts of that sentence are going to be things that you look at that you try to find links and connections with. So that first statement is the main sentence here. I thank my God always. And then these other statements are modifying in some way. For example, this next statement, I've indented it under the word thank in order to show visually that when I remember you is modifying that word thank. In this case, telling us when. Paul says, when I thank you when I remember you. And then a second phrase or clause that's connected to that. I thank my God always because I hear of your love. This tells us why Paul says, I thank my God. All right, so in block diagramming, what you're doing is trying to identify each phrase and clause and how they're connected to each other. And what that does is this. So here I'll show you a diagram for, here, remember that the second paragraph here in Philemon, I'm going to show you a diagram for the entire paragraph, just to give you an idea of where we're headed with this and why it's helpful. Let's see. I need to pull this up so that, all right. All right, hopefully you can see this here. All right, this is a full diagram. And if this isn't making any sense to you, don't worry. All right, I'm just trying to show you the whole picture first, and then we'll look and see how we got this picture. But I think it's helpful at least to see where we're going. Here's the verses 4 and 5 that I just showed you the diagram of. And then I added verses 6 and 7. All right. And notice here, this diagram sort of helps us to see the priority and the structure of this passage. And from it, we can identify two main points that Paul is making. The first is expressed in his gratitude and prayer. The second is expressed in what he prays. And so if we were to be preaching this passage, we would have two main points from this passage. One focusing on Paul's gratitude and prayer. The second on the focus of his prayer. And then that first point has two subpoints. One is talking about the declaration, thankful when I remember my prayers. The second subpoint is the reason for that declaration. And then under main point number 2, as we focus on the heart of his prayer, there's 2 points. The first is the content of his prayer, and the second is his motivation. All right? And so what the block diagram does, I'll show the outline. All right, so this would be an outline that comes from that diagram. All right, those 2 points and their 2 subpoints. What I'm going to do is we're going to spend several weeks on this because it is a very important step, is show you how do we get this diagram, which will then lead us to this outline. All right, that's going to be where we're headed. That's going to be our goal and our focus. And it is essentially done this way: by identifying the phrases and clauses and their relationship to one another, we are able to see how Paul expresses his main thought in that paragraph and everything that he says in connection to it. And this tells us, this guides us as to the author's the intent, what he's saying in that particular paragraph. Okay, and so what you're going to see, men, is that as you study a passage and in thinking about learning that text and then how you're going to teach it, what we're going to find here is that this step of diagramming allows us to see their structure here, and that it's not magic. It's not just trying to guess, okay, what seems to be the point here? I'll just try to come up with something. Actually, the diagram helps show us, because the author is using grammar, he's using rules of communication, he presents a particular thought in these phrases and clauses that are all connected to each other, but have a logical pattern and structure. All right? That structure we can show visually in what we call this block diagram, which then helps guide and direct us as to what the outline of the passage looks like. Okay? This is a tremendous tool for us. And I really want to encourage you, and I'm going to repeat this several times as we go through this part of the exegetical process, is to stay with it, to really don't give up, because there will be parts of it that might be hard to understand, especially if we're doing this in English. So I understand that will make things more challenging. But if you can grab onto this step, I'm telling you, it will really, I don't want to exaggerate, but I think it will really transform how you see a passage. It'll transform that. You'll be able to look and, oh, I see how these things all connect together. And I see what's being emphasized here. And I see how these 3 statements are connected to that main point. All right? So this is a very powerful tool to help us in our study. All right? But it's going to take a little bit of effort to get there. And so I'm going to bring up a bad word here, a scary word. Are you guys ready for it? Everybody's had your prayer time this morning, right? You ready for this? Okay. Here it comes. Grammar fundamentals. This This is painful. I was just going to relax tonight, have some tea, and sit back and listen to this, discussion about studying the Bible. And you want to talk about grammar? Oh, this is painful. English grammar, no less. Well, we need to talk about it. In order to get to this, we have to understand the building blocks. And those building blocks and how those blocks are connected together are based upon grammar. All right. And so why grammar? Well, before getting to the diagram, we have to know what the author said, and how he said it is using the rules of communication, hermeneutics. And one important hermeneutic is grammar. Grammar is what guides how we communicate with each other, especially in written form. And so Paul and Peter and James, they all used, in their case, Greek grammar. They followed the rules of Greek grammar in order to communicate their message. And so in the same way, we want to uncover what that message is by understanding the grammar. So then you ask, well, those guys, they wrote in Greek. How is studying English grammar going to help us at all? That's not the original biblical language. That's not Greek. That's not Hebrew. That's not Aramaic. Why study English grammar? Well, for one, how many of you are Greek scholars? Any Greek scholars here? Any Hebrew scholars? I've studied a little bit of Greek and Hebrew, and Joshua has, but we're not experts. At least I'm not. We know enough Greek and Hebrew to be dangerous. That's all we know. But